Hi, my name is Ophir Chen from the B2B vertical team within the IPS organization. Today I'm going to demo our capability to accelerate the conversion of WTX mappings into the Informatica toolset. WTX, or Transformation Extender, used to be called Mercator, is really the transformation engine of IBM, being used from different applications that IBM has, like WMD or Data Stage, and it's really the equivalent of B2B DT of Informatica. The process of converting WTX mappings into B2B DT goes through the process of taking the metadata of WTX into a proprietary DT transformation that at the end of the day creates DT scripts. DT is going to be used in those specific cases on two levels. One of them is during design time to create the DT scripts, and then the DT scripts that are being created are going to be used on runtime. In order to understand the process, let's make sure that we understand what the WTX metadata is like. It really has two different types of metadata. One is the mapping. This example represents a mapping file or an MMS file generated from WTX that corresponds to, in this case, a very simple map between two XMLs. It has a representation of the input, and it has a representation of the output. It may have multiple outputs, and then within that, it would describe the mapping rules of how a specific field on the target is being set. The other types of files are also being referenced from within the mapping file, and those are the type trees. Type tree is really the representation of the data, or if you want, the data model. But in addition to that, it really correlates to a parser and a serializer within the DT world. Obviously, if your source and or target are XML, you don't really need a parser within DT. But in the world of WTX, this is what it correlates to. Both of those files are really XML. So if we looked on this last file, the mapping file, we saw it's an XML. This is a file corresponding to a type tree that represents, in this case, either the source or the target. So let's see how do we take those files and create out of them the process. In the first scenario, which I'm calling simple XML mapping, I already have an XSD, the XSD corresponding to both the source and the target, in addition to the type trees, which means I don't really need to convert the type trees, I just need to convert the mapping. This is the DT process that can take the WTX MMS file or the mapping file and create out of it really two objects. Once I'm running that, I'm going to this folder called generated objects, and it creates another folder. Within it, I can find two components that are being created. One is this Excel file. The Excel file really corresponds to the mapping file, but puts it in an environment that is neutral, not really WTX, so that any developer or business analyst that wants to look on what does this WTX really do, he can open the Excel file and just see what does it do. Again, this is a very simple mapping. It only has a single map within it. And this is what this map is doing. It's taking this source that corresponds to this type tree and generates this target, which corresponds to this type tree. And those are the mapping rules of how one field is being mapped to another. In this case, the attribute ATT1, underneath the element call1, underneath the root element called source root, is being mapped into the field or the element called call1 underneath the element target root on the target side, and so on. In addition to the Excel file, it creates this TGP, which is really the DT script correlating to the logic that we just saw. I can create a new project. Do it again. Create a new project of DT. Call it simple XML. And into that project, I can take the TGP that was just created, as well as the two XSDs that, as I said, in this scenario, I'm getting because they already exist and I don't need to create them. One corresponding to the source and another one corresponding to the target. As you can see, my project right now is invalid. The reason for that, if we go to the script, is because the XPaths that are being used are really still in the WTX syntax. And this is really the main work that will be left for the user to do in order to make the conversion complete. One would have to take or double click on each one of those XPaths, in this case, and choose the right data holder for this specific scenario, for this specific XPath. So source over here and target over here. Some of those groups will be created empty as a placeholder for a line of rule that was in the WTX mapping. So mapping rule number 1 was really not doing anything, so it creates mapping rule number 1 with nothing in it. Mapping rule number 2 would correspond to mapping rule number 2 from the Excel spreadsheet or the WTX mapping. So I'm going into mapping rule number 2 and choosing, in this case, the source is attribute 1, underneath call 1, from underneath the source root element. Source root element, call 1, ATT1, that's my source, and the target goes to call 1 underneath the target root. So target root, and underneath that, call 1. And keep on doing the same for the other cases. ATT2 from underneath call 1 goes into call 2 underneath the target, and then T2 underscore call 1 from underneath table 2 from underneath the source root, table 2, T2 call 1 goes into call 3 underneath the target root. Once I'm done with this process, I can press save and do project validate. And as you can see, now when I fix the XPaths, the project is valid and technically it's ready to be used against sample data. Let's see one more scenario which could be more complex. And in this case, I'm assuming that I don't have the XSDs corresponding to the source and or target. We have another process that can take the other metadata file, which is the MTS file, and I'll take this one over here, run it, once it's done, I'm going to do the same for the other type tree that I got for this scenario. Run it again. Now when the second one is done, I can actually go to another project that I created over here. And as you can see, this is the location where those files were created. And from within this project, I already imported the two XSDs. And you can see that the difference is really in the fact that this is a far more complex mapping, a lot more mapping rules. There could be logic over here that would do one thing or else do something else, and potentially simple kind of maps or setting some simple values. But in addition to that, logic that could be more complex than that, nested logic, and so on. Important to say that the acceleration is not necessarily simple for every WTX mapping. This is where the Excel file that we generate can be very helpful in order to take a look into the actual map and verify what does it do, whether it is XML to XML kind of mapping, whether it is a mapping between some sort of a industry standard into a positional file, whether it's really just mapping or whether it does more than that. The process of verifying what does the mapping of WTX is doing is critical in order to decide whether you should use the acceleration or not. This is more or less it. If you want to have more details, or if you are interested in the capability, feel free to contact the B2B vertical team within the IPS organization. That's it. Thank you.